Hi, it's Shui here with another video for Psychology of Wellness. In this video, I'm going to talk about supportive listening skills. So, how to be a good friend to someone when they're struggling, and some do's and don'ts when it comes to supportive listening. So, supportive listening is one of those things that we all do. We've all needed someone to talk to. We've all been that person that someone came to talk to. And as a result, it's something that we all have experience with, and we all like to believe we're pretty good at it. But regardless, there are things that almost everyone does from time to time that end up being unhelpful. And there are also things that are desirable to do, but we often forget to do. So hopefully by addressing some of these things, some of the do's and don'ts, I can help you guys avoid the don'ts and do more of the do's. So before we get started though, I want to quickly talk about the difference between sympathy versus empathy, because the two words are commonly used interchangeably and that's not quite right. In simple terms, basically sympathy means feeling for someone, so feeling sorry for them, feeling concerned about them. Empathy, on the other hand, is basically feeling with someone. So the ability to put yourself in their perspective, to really see things from their way and experience those emotions alongside them. So between the two, like both of them are desirable, but sympathy by itself is usually inadequate to form emotional connections with. Uh, Empathy is the one that you ultimately want to achieve when you're supporting someone um, because it allows you to form that really relate to them and therefore make them feel like someone really does hear them. But anyways, so just keep that in mind, and if you want to learn more about sympathy versus empathy, check out the link below this video. Brené Brown is a social worker who has a cartoon on this subject, and it's actually quite entertaining, and that's where I learned the difference. And she also has a bunch of other cool stuff on her channel, so check her out. Anyways, getting on to the subject of supportive listening. So first I'm going to talk about the do's because I feel like those are the ones that we're actually familiar with. So first and foremost, you absolutely do want to pay full undivided attention to the other person. I know that sounds pretty obvious, but think about it this way. So we're in a day and age where technology is rampant, where it's pretty normal to be texting one friend while chatting with another one in person, and to be checking Facebook and Instagram like fairly regularly. So that's just the way modern first world is. But you don't want to be doing that when someone is telling you an emotional problem because it can really convey the message that you're not interested, that you don't really care. And that's the last message you want to convey to someone who's struggling because if you think back to the last time you were struggling with anything, chances are you did feel alone at one point or another. So just think about that and don't do it. As in, like, don't divide your attention. So another thing that you absolutely want to do is you want to be accepting of the other person. So part of being accepting means not being judgmental towards their feelings. So things like don't uh, don't question why they behaved in a certain way when they're telling you the background story of what got them into the situation. Don't be asking them um, don't be asking them like why did they not try this thing instead, and why didn't they just see that the solution was here and then they could have avoided it. Like, don't do that because a, it's not helpful because it's already past the situation, so you can't really turn back time, right? But b, it dismisses their feelings and it doesn't make and it just again conveys that message of, oh, you don't really care about my current feelings. All you care about is, oh, I could have avoided this, but the fact of the matter is I didn't. So why are you telling me that? So just be careful. And the other part of being accepting just means if the other person proposes a solution to a certain problem or like actions moving forward, generally you don't want to be questioning that. So obviously, if your friend is let's say, proposing that they commit a violent crime to solve to, cover up their own insecurity, that's probably not a good idea, and you would want to intervene at that point because it's dangerous. Uh, but for the most part, if what they're doing isn't going to hurt anyone or themselves and it's not really a danger, then there's not really a right or wrong way to approach a certain problem, and it's not the time for you to be imposing your personal opinions on someone, because whether or not you agree with them, that's what they propose is what's unique to them, so keep it respected. So, classic example, if you're personally pro-life and your friend wants to get an abortion after she got accidentally pregnant, it's not in your position to tell her that she should not get an abortion because it's equivalent to child murder or whatever. Like, that's not up to you to decide. That's just your opinion. So keep those feelings out and focus on the interests of the individual you're supporting. So, another thing that you absolutely want to do is you want to validate the other person's feelings. So, by validating, part of it just means accepting, but even more importantly, you want to let the other person know that their feelings are okay. So, telling them, hey, well, it's okay to feel that way because everybody struggles, that would be validating. So, I know it sounds like such a small thing, but it's truly one of those things that most of us probably don't do enough of, and it's simply because we don't really talk about it. But if you think about it, think back to the last time, again, that you were struggling with anything, and you were feeling a lot of things, so, even like socially taboo feelings like anger, jealousy, um, sadness, depression, whatever it is. Oftentimes, when we are in those situations, we don't want to admit that we're feeling those ways because we don't want to be judged. So, if you just think about that, everyone else is equally afraid of being judged. So, let the other person know that it's okay to feel how they feel, and ultimately remember that feelings don't necessarily translate to behaviors. So, a person who just broke up with their boyfriend might feel bitter towards men for a while, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are inherently a man hater, and vice versa for the girlfriend, right? Um, and of course, again, use your judgment. If they feel that the only way that they can get out of their situation is to commit suicide, and like that seems like what they're gonna do that sometime soon, then you'd probably want to intervene because they're in danger. Other than that, though, I mean, once again, there's no right or wrong way to feel a certain way, feel about something, so just accept their feelings as they are and let them know that it's okay. And the other part of empowering is just the thing about empowering someone. Sorry, the thing about validating someone's feelings is that it empowers them. So give you another example. If I told you that, oh, I'm so sad that my girlfriend broke up with me, and like I've always been afraid of losing interpersonal relationships, and now that just happened, the most significant one I had, and you told me, well, it's perfectly okay to feel that way, like it's understandable given your background. If I was to have such a background, then it basically conveys the message that like I'm not crazy and I'm just normal, and that what I'm going through is not necessarily something that no one else understands. It's totally okay, and by knowing that, oftentimes you will make the other person feel like, okay, so I'm normal, and therefore I'm just as well equipped to deal with this as everyone else. Whereas if you tell them, well, that's a stupid way to feel, or you shouldn't be feeling that way because it's not helping you, it's gonna discourage them. It's gonna make them knock their self-esteem. It's gonna make them feel, okay, well, gee, if I'm already losing, in the sense that if I'm already like being irrational now, then clearly I can't deal with the situation, so therefore I'm just gonna pretend it doesn't exist. But, hiding problems never makes them go away, as we learned as children. So validation is actually very important, so just remember that. And another thing that you want to do is you want to encourage conversation. You want to encourage openness. So there's not really one way to do this, but a few general things to remember is that you don't want to necessarily make them share things that they don't want to share, but at the same time, you want to make them feel safe enough that they can open up to you, because then it facilitates the formation of that empathic connection, which is very important when it comes to being supportive. So, encouraging conversation means, of course, just being calm, being, warm, being non-judgmental, like everything we just talked about. Excuse me again. But everything we just talked about, and also, though, just asking open-ended questions instead of phrasing things in suggestive ways. So, an example would be if, let's say, your friend is telling you a story and in it conveys that they are in relationship distress with their significant other. You don't want to, and you think that you think that this relationship isn't doing them any good, and that they really should leave it, but they seem to be, hesitant about that. You don't want to necessarily go, "You're not thinking of staying in that relationship, are you?" The problem is, even though they can respond any way they want to that, the tone I ask that in, the facial expressions, and the body language, and also just the nature I ask that question in clearly suggests that I don't want them to say that they want to stay in that relationship. And then it kind of just makes the other person feel pressure to answer one way or another, because clearly you desire one over the other, and therefore they might feel like that might translate to how much you favor them. Instead, a better way to ask would be maintain a calm and warm, like facial expressions, body language, and just say, "Hey, are you thinking of staying in this relationship, or what do you want to do about it from now on?" When you ask it that way, it lets them know that you don't expect them to behave one way or the other, and instead you just want to know what they feel, so that you just want them to freely express how they feel. So keep that in mind. Keep the conversation lines open, and don't. And the last thing I'll talk about in terms of the do's of supportive listening is set your boundaries. So I know that's contradictory to everything I just said, but it's actually not. Like, it sounds contradictory. But so what I mean by setting your boundaries is basically just know when to take a step back if you need to take a step back. So it's obviously good and it's natural to want to be there for someone when they're struggling. But let's say your friend starts calling you up at 10 times a day to the point that you aren't even getting your own life. You're falling behind on your own schedule. Then it's probably good to back off a little, because it's starting to become negative to you. And it's not selfish to need to back off. Laying the boundaries down and enforcing them, and dealing the consequences of a violation are perfectly okay and in your right to do so. It can be hard to say no to someone when they're struggling, but ultimately what you gotta remember is you are also responsible for your own health, and you can't take care of someone else if you're not well yourself. So just know that it's okay to say no when it gets to be too much. And also, don't take up any responsibilities that you aren't capable of performing. So, and I especially mean this in the professional sense. Don't diagnose and your friend with depression and attempt to give them psychotherapy if you're only like psychology major instead of a licensed psychologist. A lot of medical students seems to want to do. A lot of medical students go through that phase where they're not licensed and they think they're qualified to practice. It's called medical student syndrome. But don't do that, because if you're not properly trained, you can easily hurt the other person by practicing something wrong on them instead of help the other person. So know your professional boundaries. So that's all the do's of supportive listening. Now let's talk a bit about the don'ts. So one major no-no is do not give unsolicited advice. So giving advice is pretty natural. It's a pretty natural thing to want to do because we want to fix the other person's problems for them. But the trouble with giving advice is it's hardly ever accurate, because all advice really is how we perceive ourselves to behave in someone else's situation. But it's impossible to predict that accurately because you aren't in that emotionally distraught situation and you're not the same person as the other person, so you can't really predict how you behave until you get there. So the other thing is, when you give unsolicited advice, it gives the other person the impression that you just care about the practical side of the problem and not really their emotions. And, sometimes we do have this idea that solving the practical problem equals solving the emotions, when really that's often not the case. So if someone was abused as a child and they no longer get abused as an adult, the practical side of the issue is gone, right? But the emotions still remain. So the fact of the matter is, emotions tend to persist on their own schedule, and ultimately, to support the other person, you want to focus on their emotions, because the emotions are ultimately what's causing them the distress, not necessarily the whatever practical problem is underlying. So just instead, if someone asks you for advice, the better thing to do is just to say, I can't tell you how to solve your problem because you know it better than me. And if they keep insisting, I mean, it's okay to give them, like, entertain them with your own personal stories that are relatable. Just be careful to let them know that that is only your experience. So, things to keep in mind. Another big no-no is do not take the time to flex your debate skills with the other person. And by that I mean, if they're telling you a story and there's certain parts of it that that you're, the devil's advocate side of you sees that it can be open to debate, don't do that. Don't debate with them, because again, it dismisses their feelings and it makes especially if they're a victim of abuse or something, it can make them feel like they're the one who's in the wrong, whether or not they actually are, like, in their particular situation. We're not talking about abuse for a second. It doesn't matter. The point is, you don't want to enforce that attitude on them. So basically, if they're telling you that they have a conflict with their parents because of this, generation gap, you don't want to be saying stuff like, oh, well, I understand it's hard for you, but it's also hard for them, so you gotta understand that. Like, that just turns into lecturing them, and that's not what anybody wants in that situation, so don't do that. And another big no-no is you don't want to like, make false assumptions about the other person's situation. So it's okay to get something wrong, but if you're uncertain at all, it's best to just, like, clarify with the other person that you're following them correctly. Because if you make wrong assumptions, then it can easily turn into a huge misunderstanding that ends up destroying the connection that gets formed in the conversation. So just something to keep in mind. You also don't want you don't want to, again, derail the focus of the conversation from the emotional aspect. So I already kind of talked about that a bit. Part of that just means don't push unsolicited advice onto them. But another part just means uh, just exactly what I said. Don't derail the focus. Like, don't turn the focus away onto something else that when they clearly wanted it on their feelings. So there's many ways this can be done. For instance, don't accidentally turn it into a conversation about you. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but believe me, we've all done it. So this can take in the form of we want to share a story with them because we've had a similar experience, which is all fine and well, except we get so deep into our own story that it becomes a conversation about us instead of them. So just be careful when you are sharing your story that you don't take away the focus. So that's all I'm going to talk about with derailing the conversation. But one more thing that I want to mention in terms of a big no-no is you don't want to you don't want to give either backhanded compliments or statements such as no offense or I'm just saying or anything. Like you don't want to like give them an offensive comment and then sugarcoat it is what I'm saying. So, for instance, don't be like, "Oh, well, you lost so much weight. You look good now." That implies that they clearly didn't look good before, so don't say stuff like that. It's not necessary. And the other part of the whole, like, sugarcoating the insult, so with the whole no offense or I'm just saying statements, is just you're not going to make the statement any less offensive by saying no offense. That's actually one of my personal biggest pet peeves of people when I interact with them. But you know, it's not about me. It's just I think most people don't necessarily like it when you say that, and we think that it automatically gives us a ticket to say something bad when really that's not the case at all. So avoid those type of statements and just if you are tempted to say something like that, stop for a second, think, and just evaluate it. Is it something that really needs to be said? Because if your friend is complaining to you, let's say, about not having a date, you don't necessarily want to say to them, no offense, but that's because you're not very attractive. Like, regardless of whether or not you think that's true, it's not necessary because whether you tell them or not, it's not something that can be done anyways, right? What do you expect your friend to do? Get spend tens of thousands of dollars on plastic surgery? It's not really realistic. So just avoid those type of statements. That's all I really had to talk about. Let me think for a second. Yeah, so that's basically all I had in terms of don'ts of supportive listening. But in the end of the day, I guess all I'm saying is when you are being supportive to someone, listen with an open mind, listen with an open heart, encourage conversation, don't be judgmental, and just overall don't do anything. Don't don't disguise insults as compliments or as nice phrases, and don't force them into doing anything or discussing anything that they're uncomfortable with. So just overall, use your judgment. I think most of us has pretty good judgment in those situations, and just keep everything we talked about in mind. And that said, if you guys had a different experience and you would like to share that, then feel free to share it below this video in the comments. Otherwise, and if you disagree with something I said, then you're also free to share. Otherwise, though, I mean, I will catch you guys in the next video. Alright, later.